When Suge Knight, hip-hop's boogeyman, stepped into Wu-Tang's backyard, he thought fear alone would win, but New York wasn't scared.
And I remember looking up, and Suge was like this with the cigar in his mouth, looking down at me like this. So I'm like, damn, I just want to play with this. Why are you looking at me crazy right now?
That night, Wu-Tang humbled Death Row's boss without throwing a single punch. I've got the full story. Let's get into it. The silent standoff. When Suge Knight rolled up into a New York nightclub in the mid-90s, cats usually froze up like they seen a ghost. This wasn't just some music executive. This was the real-life boogeyman of the rap game. Standing 6'3", pushing 300 pounds, and backed by Death Row Records' ruthless machine, Suge's reputation had even the hardest street soldiers thinking twice before they stepped to him. But what nobody expected was that on this particular night, deep in Wu-Tang territory, Suge was about to get checked, not by bullets or fists, but by pure presence. Method Man was at a party in New York. Lights low, vibe strong, industry faces everywhere. The night was winding down when the lights came up, and Meth felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned around, and it was Tupac. This wasn't just any casual encounter, though. In the world of hip-hop politics during the mid-90s, when Pac pulled you aside, it meant something serious was about to go down.
The only times Puff ever stopped to speak to me. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, back in them days, during those days. You know, Big was still alive, whatever. One time, make a long story longer. We on our way out. Lights come on at the end of the party. Party on my shoulder, turn around, it's Pac. Last time, I ain't seen this all night. I ain't know he was even in there.
For those who understand the streets and the game, you know Pac didn't just randomly tap cats on the shoulder at industry functions. If Pac was reaching out, especially during the height of the East Coast versus West Coast tension, it was because he needed you to understand something crucial. And in this case, he wanted Method Man to know that the beef between coasts wasn't as black and white as the media was painting it. But here's where the story gets wild. Right behind Pac stood the boogeyman himself, Suge Knight, 6'3", nearly 300 pounds of pure intimidation, just staring, not saying a word, just burning holes through Method Man with his eyes like he was sizing up prey.
Something happened with the chain, and Pac was trying to tell me, you know, if I was there, that shit would have never happened, boo.
This moment right here was explosive. Pac was bringing up Vegas, specifically the night when RZA got into an altercation over a stolen chain. When Pac told Meth that if he had been there, that shit would have never happened, he wasn't just making conversation. He was essentially admitting that he felt responsible for not being there to protect RZA, at a time when Wu-Tang and Death Row circles were crossing paths in dangerous ways. Think about the weight of that statement. Pac wasn't speaking like some rapper bragging about money, chains, or women. He was speaking like a soldier who felt he had let a comrade down in battle. And that's what made Suge's reaction even more chilling.
And I remember looking up, and Suge was like this with the cigar in his mouth, looking down at me like this. So I'm like, damn, I just want to play with you. Why are you looking at me crazy right now and shit, you know? So then I look at Pac, and Pac got a whole different face.
Suge wasn't co-signing Pac's peace talk. He wasn't smiling, wasn't nodding along like some supportive business partner. Homeboy was scowling, threatened by what he was witnessing. Because in that moment, Pac was making it crystal clear that his loyalty wasn't fully locked down to Death Row. It was to his friends, his real ones. And Wu-Tang was definitely in that category. Now let's break down the bigger picture here, because this is where the psychology gets deep. Suge had built his entire empire on fear, on controlling artists through muscle, intimidation, and the constant threat of violence. His whole business model was based on making people too scared to cross him, too terrified to even think about going against Death Row. But if one of his biggest stars, Pac himself, was openly showing love and protection toward Wu-Tang, that undermined everything Suge represented. It showed cracks in the foundation he'd built through fear. Here's where it gets even more haunting. Method Man remembered something specific about Pac's face that night, something that still gives him chills decades later.
His face looked like that picture before he died, that face he had. Oh,
That's prophetic as hell. What Meth was describing wasn't just some random vibe. It was foreshadowing. Pac seemed to be carrying the weight of something bigger that night, like he knew storm clouds were gathering. Maybe that's why he was reaching out to Meth, extending that olive branch to Wu-Tang, almost like he was trying to tie up loose ends before the inevitable hit. But for Suge, all he saw was weakness. All he saw was his #1 asset connecting with the very East Coast crew that Death Row was supposed to be at war with. That's why Suge's stare was so intense, so predatory, because at that moment, Wu-Tang wasn't bending the knee. And here's where Wu-Tang secretly checked Suge Knight without throwing a single punch or saying a hostile word. Method Man didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He didn't show fear or submission. The fact that Meth stood his ground, maintained eye contact, and refused to be intimidated, that was the check. It was psychological warfare at its finest. In New York, Wu-Tang was untouchable, and Suge was learning that lesson the hard way. See, Suge expected deference everywhere he rolled up. He was used to walking into rooms and having grown men shrug shrink back, having industry. Executives kiss his ring out of pure terror. But New York was different territory entirely. Wu-Tang wasn't just another rap group trying to make it in the industry. They were a movement, a family, a certified army that had carved their power from Staten Island to Brooklyn, and they damn sure weren't about to hand over their pride to some West Coast label boss. The East Coast didn't just respect Wu-Tang Clan, they revered them like hip-hop royalty. By the mid-90s, Wu wasn't just dominating the charts and moving units, they had completely reshaped the cultural landscape of rap music. They were the first collective to successfully blend gritty street narratives with complex martial arts mythology, turning themselves into larger-than-life characters that felt both real and mythical. Their debut album, Enter the Wu-Tang, 36 Chambers, had changed hip-hop forever, and by 1995 to 96, each member was carving out individual success while still flying under the same unified banner. Their business model was revolutionary. They pioneered a structure where each member could sign solo deals with different companies while still feeding into the Wu-Tang brand. So when Suge Knight, the face of Death Row Records, walked into a New York party where Wu-Tang members and affiliates were posted up, he wasn't stepping onto neutral ground. He was walking into territory that didn't recognize his authority, didn't respect his intimidation tactics, and definitely wasn't impressed by his reputation. What makes this whole situation even more fascinating is how Pac was caught in the middle, almost like a diplomat trapped between two worlds that were increasingly at odds. On one hand, he was the crown jewel of Death Row, the artist Suge had rescued from prison by posting his $1.4 million bail. On the other hand, Pac had deep, unbreakable ties to New York, to Harlem, to crews like Wu-Tang. His roots weren't Death Row, they were East Coast, born and bred. That night, when Pac told Meth about the chain-snatching incident in Vegas and how things would have gone differently if he'd been there, it wasn't just casual conversation. It was Pac affirming to Wu-Tang, "I see you, I ride with you, I've got your back when it counts." That single statement was like an earthquake in the room, because Suge was standing right there, close enough to hear every word. Suge, the man who demanded all of Pac's loyalty, hearing his own superstar express regret over not protecting Wu-Tang's leader. That's like your star quarterback telling another team's captain, "I should have had your back." The subtext was impossible to miss. Pac was straddling two worlds, and Death Row didn't have his heart completely locked down. The mid-90s, East versus West rivalry wasn't just media hype designed to sell magazines and records. It was real tension with real consequences. The Source and Vibe magazines had turned it into a national narrative that dominated hip-hop coverage. Battle lines were clearly drawn. On one side, you had Suge Knight's Death Row Records, with Pac and Snoop Dogg leading the charge. On the other side, Sean Puff Daddy Combs' Bad Boy Records, with Biggie as the crown jewel. But what people often forget, what gets lost in the simplified narrative, is that Wu-Tang sat completely outside of that binary conflict. They weren't Death Row, they weren't Bad Boy, they were their own universe, raw, hungrier, and frankly more dangerous in some ways because they weren't playing the same industry games or following the same rules. So when Suge locked eyes on Method Man that night, what he saw wasn't just another rapper or industry player. He saw a symbol of independence, of defiance against the system he was trying to control. Meth wasn't bending because Wu-Tang didn't need Suge. They weren't afraid to make their own way, build their own empire, and they definitely didn't need Death Row muscle to validate their position in hip-hop. That silent standoff revealed everything about the balance of power in the culture, and it foreshadowed the storms that were about to break loose across the entire hip-hop landscape. The empire built on fear. To understand why that stare down in New York was so significant, you need to grasp just how absolutely terrified the entire music industry was of Suge Knight. This wasn't just respect or admiration, this was pure primal fear that made grown men change their travel plans and industry executives hide behind bodyguards.
So I'm at the Vibe Awards,
Facts.
and this nigga walk in. This is the first time I'm with my wife, right? Suge Knight walk in. He just walked in, bro. Walked in with a cigar by himself. Alicia Keys start running. Russell Simmons, no action, no business. Every running niggas is getting up out of there. Every New York killer, whatever you name, all these niggas that was like the niggas they write books about and put in movies, just running to the back.
Let that sink in for a moment. Fat Joe is describing a scene where legitimate street legends, cats who had reputations that preceded them in the most dangerous neighborhoods, were literally running for the exits when Suge walked into the building. We're talking about dudes who had faced down real killers, who had survived the concrete jungles of New York, and they were scrambling like school children when the boogeyman showed up. Suge's reputation as the most feared man in hip-hop wasn't built on empty threats or media hype. It was constructed through a documented pattern of violence, intimidation, and ruthless business tactics that blurred the lines between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. His methods were straight out of a gangster playbook. Knight employed gang members as security and enforcers at death row, turning the label into what many described as a criminal enterprise. He was backed financially by alleged drug kingpin Michael Harry O. Harris and had connections to attorney David Kenner, who reportedly had mob ties. This network gave him the muscle to enforce deals through pure intimidation. But Suge's most chilling demonstration of power came through specific incidents that became hip-hop legend, and the most notorious of these involved Eazy-E, the godfather of West Coast gangsta rap. To launch Death Row Records, Knight allegedly confronted Eazy-E with enforcers armed with baseball bats, forcing him to release Dr. Dre and the Doc from their contracts at Ruthless Records. Eazy-E later claimed that Knight had threatened not just his life, but his family's safety as well. This strong-arming tactic allowed Death Row's inception, but it set a terrifying precedent for how Knight would handle business disputes going forward. The Eazy-E situation became even more sinister after the NWA legend died of AIDS complications in 1995. For years afterward, rumors swirled about the circumstances of his death, and Suge himself added fuel to those conspiracy theories in the most disturbing way possible. In a 2003 interview on Jimmy Kimmel Live, Suge made comments that sent chills through the hip-hop community.
See, technology is so high, right?
Right.
So if you shoot somebody, you go to jail forever. So the kids, you don't want to go to jail forever, right? So they got this new thing out there. People sell them all the time. They got this stuff they get blood from somebody with AIDS, and then they shoot you with it.
Oh,
so
well, that seems bad.
That's a slow death.
Yeah.
An easy thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, no. Okay.
While these claims about Eazy-E have been debunked by medical experts and family members, Suge's willingness to even suggest such methods revealed the psychological warfare he employed. It wasn't enough for him to just beat people up or threaten them. He wanted them to believe he was capable of anything, no matter how twisted or calculated. This fear factor extended far beyond individual confrontations. Knight's intimidation tactics included having gang members beat bad boy affiliates, forcing one rival to drink urine, and sending armed men to Warren G's house over business disputes. The man operated like a crime boss who happened to run a record label, rather than a music executive who occasionally got tough. One of the most infamous examples of Knight's bullying involved Vanilla Ice and the song Ice Ice Baby. According to multiple accounts, Knight and his associates dangled Vanilla Ice from a hotel balcony in Las Vegas until he signed over publishing rights to the track. This wasn't just business negotiation, it was extortion through the threat of death. The psychological impact of these tactics cannot be overstated. Industry insiders described an atmosphere where grown men would change their travel plans to avoid crossing paths with Suge. Record executives would hire extra security when they knew he might be attending the same events. Artists would literally flee venues when word spread that he had arrived. At the 1995 Source Awards, when Suge took his infamous shot at Puff Daddy, the New York crowd booed him mercilessly, but you could feel the tension in the room. People weren't just disagreeing with his words, they were genuinely afraid of what might happen next.
Any artist out there want to be an artist and want to stay a star and don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the record, dancing. Come to Death Row.
That statement wasn't just a diss, it was a declaration of war, delivered in front of an audience filled with East Coast artists, affiliates, and fans. The crowd's reaction of loud boos showed that New York wasn't having it, but the underlying message was clear. Suge believed he could intimidate his way into controlling the entire hip-hop landscape. What made Suge's reign of terror so effective was the unpredictability of his violence. Reports documented that he employed mafia-style tactics to maintain his intimidation factor, creating an environment where nobody knew when or how he might strike. This uncertainty kept potential rivals in a constant state of anxiety and submission. Even established street figures gave Suge a wide berth. When he attempted to coerce a verse from Jadakiss using these same intimidation methods, it demonstrated how his reach extended beyond just West Coast artists. The fact that he felt comfortable trying to strong-arm an East Coast rapper showed just how convinced he was of his own invincibility. Dr. Dre himself left Death Row in 1996 without demanding any compensation, specifically because he feared Knight's thuggish reputation and violent inclinations. Think about that. The man who had helped build Death Row into a multi-million-dollar empire walked away from his own creation because staying meant living under constant threat. This pattern of fear and control is what made Wu-Tang's resistance so significant. While everyone else in the industry was either running away or kissing the ring, Method Man stood his ground in that New York nightclub. Wu-Tang represented something that Suge couldn't understand or control. Power that wasn't built on fear, but on genuine respect, artistic innovation, and cultural authenticity. The irony is that Suge's empire, empire, built entirely on intimidation, was ultimately more fragile than Wu-Tang's movement, which was built on creativity and brotherhood. Fear may have given Suge short-term control, but it also created enemies everywhere he went and planted the seeds of his own destruction. As we'll see in the final chapter of this story, the very tactics that made Suge Knight the most feared man in hip-hop would eventually become the weapons that brought down his entire empire. The empire falls. By September 7th, 1996, everything had changed. Tupac Shakur, the brightest star in hip-hop and Suge's most valuable asset, was gunned down in Las Vegas. The murder remains officially unsolved, but the ripple effects of that tragic night would eventually bring down the entire death row empire that Suge had built through fear and intimidation. The shooting happened after Suge and Pac attended a Mike Tyson fight. Earlier that evening, they had been involved in a brutal assault on Orlando Anderson, a suspected Crip gang member, in the lobby of the MGM Grand. This wasn't just some random altercation. It was the kind of street violence that Suge had used to build his reputation, but this time, it would have devastating consequences. What many people don't realize is that this assault was actually a violation of Suge's probation from a previous conviction. Knight had been sentenced to 5 years probation in 1995 for assaulting 2 rappers in a Hollywood recording studio. The Vegas incident would later land him in serious legal trouble, but at the time, he thought he was untouchable. Hours after the MGM assault, Suge and Pac were driving to a club when their BMW was riddled with bullets at a red light. Pac died 6 days later from his injuries, while Suge survived with minor wounds. The official investigation never produced any arrests, but theories about the shooting have dominated hip-hop conspiracy discussions for decades. With Pac gone, cracks in Suge's empire became impossible to hide. Snoop Dogg, one of the label's biggest stars, began pulling away from Death Row, eventually signing with No Limit Records. The same artist who had helped build Death Row's reputation was now fleeing from Suge's increasingly unstable leadership. Dr. Dre had already escaped. In 1996, founding Aftermath Entertainment and taking his production genius with him. Without Dre's musical vision and Pac's star power, Death Row began hemorrhaging money and credibility at an alarming rate, but Suge's legal troubles were just beginning. In February 1997, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison for violating his probation through the Orlando Anderson assault. The man who had terrorized the music industry for years was suddenly behind bars, watching his empire crumble from a prison cell. The violence that had made Suge powerful eventually consumed him completely. His story took an even darker turn in 2015 when he became involved in another deadly confrontation that would end his reign permanently. On January 29, 2015, Knight was involved in a hit-and-run incident in Compton that killed Terry Carter and injured CLE Bone Sloan. The incident occurred after Knight arrived uninvited at the set of the NWA biopic Straight Outta Compton, leading to a confrontation with film consultant Sloan. Surveillance video from the scene showed Knight backing over Sloan with his red Ford F-150 Raptor, then accelerating forward and running over both Sloan and Carter. Carter, a 55-year-old friend who had been trying to mediate between Knight and Dr. Dre, was killed instantly from blunt force trauma. Knight claimed self-defense, alleging that he feared for his life after being attacked, but the evidence told a different story. Multiple eyewitnesses described the collision as deliberate, and no weapons were found at the scene to support Knight's claims of being threatened. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, complicated by Knight's health issues and multiple attorney changes. He was hospitalized several times for blood clots, appendicitis, and a possible brain tumor, leading to numerous delays in his trial. Finally, on September 20th, 2018, facing the possibility of life in prison, Knight pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter. On October 4th, 2018, he was sentenced to 28 years in prison under California's 3 strikes law, which enhanced his sentence due to his previous felony convictions. Knight is currently incarcerated at R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego and will be eligible for parole in October 2034, when he'll be 69 years old. The man who once struck fear into the hearts of hip-hop's biggest names is now spending his golden years behind bars, a cautionary tale about the ultimate cost of building power through violence. The contrast with Wu-Tang's trajectory couldn't be more stark. While Suge's empire collapsed under the weight of its own violence and criminality, Wu-Tang continued to thrive and expand their influence. They released Wu-Tang Forever in 1997, a double album that sold millions and cemented their status as global icons. Their independence model proved sustainable in ways that Suge's fear-based system never could. Throughout Suge's downfall, Wu-Tang maintained their position through the same principles that had allowed them to check him in that New York nightclub: authenticity, artistic innovation, and genuine respect rather than intimidation. They never needed to threaten anyone to maintain their throne in hip-hop culture. In recent years, Suge's former empire has come full circle. Death Row's catalog has changed hands multiple times and was most recently acquired by Snoop Dogg, the very artist who once had to escape from Suge's grip. The irony is impossible to miss. The label that was built through fear and violence is now owned by someone who fled from that very system. Wu-Tang, meanwhile, remains a global brand that has transcended hip-hop entirely. From clothing lines to video games, from solo careers to documentaries, they've built something that endures because it was founded on creativity and brotherhood rather than intimidation and violence. Looking back at that silent confrontation in the New York nightclub, it's clear that Method Man's refusal to be intimidated was more than just a single moment of defiance. It was a preview of hip-hop's future, a future where authentic artistry and genuine respect would outlast fear-based power structures. Suge Knight thought he could control hip-hop culture through violence and intimidation, but Wu-Tang proved that real power comes from staying true to your principles and never backing down from what you believe in. That night in New York, when Meth stared back at Suge without flinching, he was representing more than just himself or even Wu-Tang Clan. He was standing up for a different vision of what hip-hop could be, one where creativity triumphed over criminality, where respect was earned rather than demanded, and where true power came from building something lasting rather than tearing others down. The legacy of that moment continues to resonate today. While Suge Knight sits in a prison cell, counting down the years until he's eligible for parole, Wu-Tang Clan remains active, influential, and respected across multiple generations of hip-hop fans. They prove that you don't need to be the most feared to be the most powerful. Sometimes the quiet strength to stand your ground is all the power you need. In the end, Wu-Tang's secret wasn't that they checked Suge Knight through violence or threats. Their secret was that they represented everything his empire wasn't: authentic, independent, and unafraid. That quiet defiance in a New York nightclub foreshadowed the collapse of one empire and the enduring strength of another, reminding us that in hip-hop, as in life, respect will always outlast fear.